Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's live stream. I'm super excited today to be talking with Amanda Milligan from Stacker Studio. We're going to be talking about something that a lot of content marketers, I think, try their best to avoid, which is link building. But in this case, we're going to talk about it from a little bit of a different angle. We're going to talk about earning links and sort of using content to attract links without sort of your traditional outreach and guest posting and all the other stuff that you've probably heard about in terms of link building. We're going to kind of approach it from a different angle and learn about how Amanda and Stacker Studio approach content marketing through sort of a media and PR driven approach. So again, really excited. We're going to have Amanda on in just a moment. We're going to talk through that. First of all, before I forget, if you have questions as we're going through or questions in general about link building or earning links or creating content and pitching it, etc., please pop those in the comments now or throughout the session. We'll be happy to get to those when we are able to. Secondly, I would love if you can, please like this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps other people find our content. We also host workshops, Q&As, teardowns, all kinds of cool video content that happens here on our channel every couple of weeks. So yeah, would love to have you on for future sessions. And of course, if you're not already a member of Top of the Funnel, please join us there, yesoptimist.com/tofu. It's a free Slack community where we host all kinds of cool sessions and content related to content marketing, SEO, link building, running an agency, freelancing, all kinds of stuff, kind of the business of content, if you will. Amanda is a member, and she has joined us there in some conversations in Slack. There's also work opportunities, all kinds of stuff that's happening inside the community. So yeah, would love to have you join us there. yesoptimist.com/tofu. And one final note before we kick off, which is they are doing construction directly above my head. So apologies in advance if there's background noise. I'm going to try to minimize, but as you all probably know, working from home is its own thing. So we'll do our best. All right. With all that said, I'm super excited again to bring on Amanda, who will be joining us today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Hi, everyone.
Hey, great. Great to have you today. I'm super excited. I was super interested to hear your background. We were just talking before the stream about kind of coming from journalism and moving into marketing, which I feel like is just such a common story amongst our sort of cohort. Is it not?
Yeah, especially content people. It's like, oh, how'd you end up in marketing like with a content focus? You were probably a writer at some point. You cared about that back in the day.
Yeah. And actually I think it's so funny because I think that's it's just such an interesting part of what we're going to be discussing today, which is really sort of that intersection of marketing and journalism, and sort of how do you apply those journalism skills in a way that also sort of helps hit your marketing KPIs, really, when you think about it. Because I think we tend to put things in buckets. Hey, here's journalism, or here's like brand journalism, and then here's like marketing and SEO way over here. But I think in this case, we're sort of marrying those two things and kind of finding some middle ground.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see the industry gradually move that way. Like more and more companies have more of that overlap going on rather than the strict silos. But the siloing is unfortunately still very common, and I feel for anybody who's watching who is in that structure.
For sure. Awesome. Well, I'd love to just kind of get right into it. I think, for to kind of set context for everyone, I'd love to talk a little bit just about link building or, backlinks and sort of SEO in general. So I guess just from your experience, like what is sort of the impact of link building? Do you have any like specific demonstrable examples, like, hey, we built links and we saw these kind of results, or what's sort of the validation, or why is it valuable for people to think about this?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been agency side for a while, and now I was telling Tyler I'm in-house at an agency style place. So it's an interesting combination. But our brand partners and our clients hire us specifically for links a lot of the time, not all the time, because there's also authority and awareness, which is a whole other conversation and is still very important. But links are basically a metric of authority. So yes, we have like a ton of case studies that show like earning links can dramatically improve your organic growth, but there's an asterisk there, because the way that I talk about it is some people think about links as like a foolproof method to grow. They're like, oh, we got links, we're done. Like that's it. That's the thing you need. Is that something you're familiar with too?
Yeah, I think it comes through. I think I see two angles. One is people, sort of treat link building as its own end, right? Like that's our main goal is we're just trying to build links, and we think that it will translate into something, but we haven't quite figured out what. And then on the other side, you've got people who are like, no, I just have to create the world's best content, and I never think about links ever, and trust me, it'll work.
Right, you're 100% right. And so the way that I think about SEO is three different tiers. It's the technical, which has to come, that's foundational. Everything else you're doing on your site, if you don't have good technical SEO, like why bother with everything else? Then the on-site content has to be top quality and deserving of the rankings you're trying to get for it. And
Right.
then when you're there, you layer in the link earning component, because I've seen clients who they understand the benefit of links, but their site was not really up to snuff when they got all this authority and they got all these media mentions, and they're like, why are we not really seeing any growth? And it was like, because really the pages you're trying to rank for don't really deserve to be like 1, 2, or 3 if you look at the SERP, right? So that's like, you need all three. So you can't really kind of like do any of them in a vacuum. You have to layer them on.
Totally. Yeah. I think about that all the time as well. And just to kind of put a point on that, I think, what we've always found is that, the impact of link building or link earning is sort of twofold, right? It's like whatever page or content is earning the links sees like a direct benefit, but then you also have kind of a site-wide component where, just sort of accruing links to your site in general kind of helps to, the metaphor I always use, like raise the ship,
I've definitely used that same metaphor.
That's awesome. So, if people are, let's say, on the fence or not sure about link building, or maybe aren't there yet, like, do you have a way to kind of help people understand when might be like a good time to invest in link building or start thinking about earning links for their site?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that the on-site content component has to come first. So if you're still like kind of early in developing a blog, or excuse me, like you have ideas for tools and resources that you think can rank really well, do that first. Just because like really what we're trying to do is drive authority to your site, like you mentioned. And if which on your site is not prepped to receive that authority, you're not really going to get the most out of it. Excuse me.
No worries.
So, question came in. Yeah, people, if you're watching, comment your current opinion on links, because that would be awesome to see. But
tell us what you're doing with link building, or if you're doing nothing right now.
Which is a lot of people, and I totally get that. Like, that's fine. It's just, to your point, it's knowing when link building is great for scaling. So a lot of times people have plateaued in their organic traffic, or they're like, our blog is killer and we're not getting what we think we deserve. Like, if you're thinking these things to yourself, link earning is probably the way to go. And it's the way to invest in the long term, because you're like, okay, the content's ready to go. We're starting to get there. We're on page 2. We feel like if we just get that boost and we prove to readers and to Google that what we're doing is authoritative and that we're experts in this area. Like you mentioned, not everybody believes in looking at domain authority as it's not a ranking factor, but it still could be useful. That's where I land on that issue. Seeing the authority of your site and your brand improve can help everything else improve as well. So those are the questions. If you feel like you're plateauing in your traffic, or you feel like you're not getting what you think you should deserve from your on-site content, I think those are good times to really invest in link earning.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, to kind of put some metrics on that, you mentioned sort of, you're on page 2, or, maybe you're bottom of page 1 even, or whatever, like you're seeing sort of proof that your site is set up, that the content that you're creating is good, but you're probably not seeing kind of the end result of the actual traffic. You're not ranking, top 3 on the queries that you're going after, whatever. And then using a tool like Ahrefs or whatever to also like evaluate, like, is there also a significant gap between the content that does rank and your site in terms of links and authority and that kind of stuff, I think can really help you kind of pinpoint, okay, now, this is going to kind of get us over this hump and into the next phase.
Yeah, totally agree.
Cool. So today, obviously, again, we sort of touched on a bunch of, link building or, link earning in general. But today, I think we're going to be talking kind of about like one sort of specific strategy, which is this idea of like earning links with content. Can we just talk a little bit about that? Kind of tell us what that looks like in general.
Yeah. So, and this might actually touch on Isabel's question a little bit, but I'll preface it with saying my philosophical opinion on the two, because really it's a mindset difference. So you might have the same link as a result of trying to build or earn. But when I think about building links, I think like every tactic falls under that. Like Fat Joe has mentioned, like whatever way you're using to get them, that's building links. So whether it's black hat, gray hat, white hat, whatever, you're like, I need links, and you don't really care about how you're getting them. You want them, okay? Earning links to me is, I want the link, obviously. Like I know that the link is indicative of the authority that I'm building, but I want to be deserving of it and create something of value to users, like real people, to like get a more organic way of earning it. Because not only does that tend to lead to better links and more sustainable link earning over time, you're creating really great stuff to do it, which means there's like a ton of other benefits that come along with it that also improve your authority. So it's mostly a mindset difference. It's instead of just thinking only of the results, it's going back to like, why are we trying to build links in the first place? It's not just to like game Google and increase your rankings. It's to show everybody, like, I know what I'm talking about. So what can I create to show that? And then you're earning it. Like it's a middle step and a specific way of going about it that I know is tempting to skip, because you want the link right now. You want to just throw some money out there and get them, but it doesn't end up having, in my opinion, I think you can see results from that quickly, but I don't think they're lasting. And I don't think you're building a brand or, authority in the same way as you would doing it the earning way. So that's the top line. So like, Isabel, I probably won't like address like specific, companies doing this type of stuff, but I think that, if you're creating your own content or you have a vendor that you trust creating great content and they're earning the coverage in, legitimate ways, I think that goes a lot farther. I'm biased. My whole career has kind of been in this realm of earned media and kind of, just earning it rather than paying for it or tapping into different networks. And that's fine. Like people do it and it works. But I think that step, that middle piece of, I just create something that's pretty badass, and it's going to get more links because you don't have to, convince people that hard that it's great. It's going to last longer for that reason. And you're just going to have great content that people are going to want to engage with. So that's the summary, I suppose, even though I rambled a bit.
It's funny. I think it sort of reminds me of like the SEO versus PPC kind of debate. It's like, why should you invest in SEO? Well, it's like a long-term thing. You're not going to get instant results, but like over time, you're sort of building like this asset or like this something that's valuable that's going to hopefully continue to return results for you. So like buying links from a vendor or whatever, like an agency, it can have its place in your strategy, but I think it is more of a short-term, like instant gratification kind of thing versus like, hey, we're going to invest in this as like a very long-term thing and really focus on our site.
That's a great point. And a friend of mine mentioned the concept of a link earning stack to me, which I thought was fascinating. And I wrote a post for Moz about it because I was like, you're right. Like you really probably aren't building links in one way only. And then that's it. Right. Like you need, I tend to work in the realm of like overall domain authority, but also I know how difficult it is to build links to specific pages. That's like the hardest thing ever to do, I think, in SEO. And there's other ways to do that, but they're not all equal. Like they're not all going to be the same approach. So you made a good point that like there's different ways to do it, and you might not be doing one. You might be doing a mix.
Yeah. And I think this is also an interesting point, which I want to kind of unpack for people, because I think the strategy here might not always be obvious. I think sometimes when people think about link building, they think about, okay, I've got this article and it's about content marketing, and I want it to rank number one when people Google content marketing. So I need to focus all my effort on building links to this specific page. which again, I think that is part of the toolkit, right? That's part of a strategy, and it makes sense. But I think, the approach that you all use is going to be a little different, because it's not necessarily going to be about targeting that specific page. It's about creating a new asset or a new piece of content that's going to build links to like kind of the overall domain. Is that sort of the right way to think about it?
Well, yes, it's like this comes into play at the beginning. And just like SEOs in general want to be in the room and like being part of the conversations before something like launches, and like, and now make it rank. Like it's the same in all of this. It's like if you have the right mindset at the beginning, you're able to create the content that will earn the links, rather than kind of, not to say that you can't rank for stuff you already created, but hopefully you go into it thinking, I don't want to just create something average and then just get as many links as I can. It's like, okay, I do want to earn those links, but I also need to, if I'm going to outrank everybody else doing the same thing, also probably out there trying to get links, or not, you're not the only one, you have to create something that's deserving of it. Yeah. So I think that is a big differentiation, is doing it from the beginning rather than just trying to think of it as an afterthought or like a task to check off, like, and I built links, and I'm
right. Yeah, that's one thing that we talk a lot with clients about, is sort of having different goals for different pieces of content. So going back to that example, say we've got a guide that's on content marketing and it's really great. We might approach link building rather than just trying to build links to that specific page. To your point, we might create a new asset that is related to content marketing that we're trying to build links to or earn links to that page, and then sort of rely on domain and topical authority and some of these sort of squishy topics, as well as like just using internal links to kind of funnel
100%.
some of that.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So I think we're kind of speaking the same language. Yeah. And folks, if that's not clear, if you are sort of coming to this thinking of link to page, goes up in the SERP kind of mindset, and not thinking about sort of more holistic, topical authority and domain authority and those kind of things, feel free to toss questions. We can explain a little bit more about kind of how that strategy plays out. But okay, that's great.
Just one on that note, I even think of authority on the funnel. Like when you talk about top of the funnel, I even think about top of the funnel authority versus bottom of the funnel authority. Like, case studies, testimonials, stuff, more bottom of the funnel. But I think that what people don't capitalize on is top of the funnel authority, which is kind of like this more tangential content that earns you links and media. It's often overlooked because it's hard to measure, but it can be a huge differentiator. It's a huge competitive advantage over others if they're not investing in it as well. But
for sure. Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to think about it. There's a lot of different ways you can kind of slice and dice, the concept of authority and kind of how it how it helps different parts of the funnel and different types of content and all that good stuff. So great. Okay, so I want to do kind of a quick sort of clarification point. How does sort of earning links and the approach that you all take, how does that compare to the concept of like digital PR? Do you all see that as sort of a similar or the same kind of approach?
Yeah, great question. So I have to caveat that Stacker is kind of a unique model. So I'll talk about that and then talk about just generally the difference between like digital PR and like this kind of link building. Sure. Stacker, so the reason I was at an agency and they did digital PR, meaning digital PR can mean a lot of things. Let's just say that. Like it's a broad umbrella. It's literally, PR earning online. And a lot of the ways people do that is by trying to get their brand mentioned in the media. So the overlap with SEO is more top of the funnel. SEO, like when you're trying to earn links, it's not going to be as, or if you're trying to earn media, you're not going to be talking about your brand. Like the media doesn't care. If you're trying to earn it, they don't want to hear about you. They're going to think it's an ad and they're going to be like, give us money. If you want to do that, we're not going to talk about it for free. So digital PR and SEO overlap in that more top of the funnel tangential content realm where you create something really interesting. And we'll talk about like what that can look like a piece of content that is newsworthy that the publishers want to cover, and then they cite you as the source. So overlapping with digital PR, because you are still earning media for your brand, it's just not, digital PR also includes like stuff about your company, about your brand, about your founder, about your story. And that's not really going to work super well with the SEO like link earning approach, because media is not going to be as interested in that. But PR people know how to go out and get that kind of coverage without building a piece of content. And that's why they're not synonymous with each other. But so I was in that world, and then Stacker approached me and they're like, oh, we have a newswire we don't pitch things. We send them out and they choose whether to run it, which was fascinating to me because I was like, pitching is one of the hardest parts of this, I think. It's really difficult, and that's why people skip it, because it's annoying a lot of the time, and it's like, it's not immediate. You don't get the instant gratification. Sometimes you get no response or an angry one, so not often, if you're doing a job right. But so we create stories on behalf of our brand partners, like newsworthy stories. Again, these aren't press releases or anything super branded. We'll create a piece of content on their behalf, and then we send it out through the newswire, and nobody has an obligation to run it. They all just choose to. So it's still earned, but it's a different mechanism to create something and distribute it. So if you're doing this, you're going to have two pieces. You have the creation of the content, and then you have the distribution of it or the promotion of it, which typically is like a digital PR approach where you're sending an email, hopefully like personalized. You spent time targeting the right writers. You explain what it is about it that is interesting to them and their audience. And then we have like the syndication distribution style that's a little bit different, where Stacker started as a newswire. That's why they can do this, because they built trust with these publications. And that's the hard part. And same with pitching. It's building the trust, establishing yourself and your own company as an authority. It's all authority. Everything's authority. So yeah, we can dive into anything specific, but in general, like digital PR does include more than what we're talking about today, but it certainly overlaps, and that's why you'll hear that phrase mentioned a lot in terms of link building.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Yeah, to think about digital PR sort of this broad umbrella, and I think maybe the way that makes sense to me to think about that is like it sort of involves both like being included in conversations and also like this idea of sort of creating the conversations or creating the stories.
Yes.
Which sort of both of those fit under digital PR. But when we think about earning links, we're generally thinking about this idea of like creating the story itself, sort of creating the news.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
and it's like, tools like Haro and stuff where people are out there trying to, they're trying to get like, it's probably not that they create a piece of content, but maybe they have an expert on their staff who can answer the question that a reporter's looking for, right?
Right.
And if you're not familiar with Haro, it's help a reporter out. A lot of PR people use it, and people use the links as well. But yeah, to your point, it's like creating the story or trying to participate in like current conversations. Definitely different approaches, and both are good.
Great. That's a super helpful clarification. And again, just a quick preface that they're getting real serious about this construction. So sorry in advance. But I think that's a great segue. So I'm going to press you, by the way, Amanda, later on to talk a little bit more about the pitching piece, because I think not everyone has the advantages of Stacker Studio. So how do you approach it? But we won't talk about that quite yet. I want to talk about like the actual content that you're creating, and maybe we can talk about specific examples of successful content or campaigns that have worked for earning links for clients.
Yes. So there are several components that go into this. I think if you're starting to do this or you're trying to improve, the easiest thing to do is to focus on data. And the reason I say that is because you basically, and this is harkening back to our journalism backgrounds, newsworthiness is key to earning media, which sounds obvious. We're talking about the news, it should be newsworthy, but what that actually means can get a little more nebulous. We're not breaking news as marketers, probably, unless we have like a full newsroom in somewhere. So if we're not breaking, local news, we're not doing that sort of stuff. We have to kind of create news or contextualize it, are two of the ways that I think about it. So data, either maybe you have internal data that's interesting, or you run a survey, or there's a ton of public data. We use public data all the time. Government sources there's so many of them, it's unbelievable. And even though they exist, not everybody's analyzing them in the same way. They're not comparing it to other data sets and looking for correlations that are interesting. But data, if it's analyzed in a new way or even visualized in a new way, can be newsworthy because it's the first time it's being presented that way. Even if the information has been around for 6 months, if nobody's taken the time to really analyze it in an interesting, impactful way, that is still newsworthy. You're taking that data and providing a news story, right? So I think data is kind of like the shortcut to a lot of the things, the other elements of newsworthiness. for people who are trying to do this, especially like more than once, right? But I mentioned contextualization. Stacker's really great about this. Back to the point about how we're not really breaking news. It's like, how do we take this topic that people are talking about and add a different perspective, a different viewpoint to it that maybe isn't being covered as much? A lot of the questions our newsroom asks themselves is like, how is this different in the past? How does this differ to similar things? And how does it differ to different things? And I think the best way to break that down, because that can sound fairly vague, is one of our newsroom staff gave me the example of, say you're talking about like education budget, right? So if you're talking about the current education budget, how is it different, or government, like what the government is deciding to allot? Well, how is that different from the past years, decades? Has it improved, declined? Is it stagnant? What have been the factors, etc.? Then you can compare it to other budgets. How much is going to education versus military or whatever else? And then you can compare it to completely different things like education budget and student loans or whatever, like for the whole state of education in the country. So thinking, even just having that framework of asking yourself these questions can lead to interesting additional viewpoints of a topic that's already being covered. Because maybe something newsworthy happens in education, you're like, yeah, I'm not covering this thing that's happening in Congress, but interesting to kind of zoom out a little bit and think about, like, why is this important? What is the history of this, and why should people care? You might be able to pull these other threads that can lead to interesting perspectives. So those are a couple things. I feel like I can talk about this for a million years, but data to me, if that's why it's like creating, either using the data or contextualizing, using these other questions to kind of even use data as well. The overlap is ideal.
Right. Yeah, I think that's such a great point, because really what you're describing here is storytelling, right? You're taking a point of data or a piece of data, and you're adding enough additional data or context to have some kind of a story to tell, right? So this year's education budget on its own doesn't tell you much. But
exactly.
Like you said, if you compare that to last year's or 10 years ago, now there's a story. Has it gone up or down? There's a narrative here. There's something to unpack and sort of analyze.
Absolutely. And then the example of the rural hospital. So Stacker did a story about rural hospital closures. They found a data set about rural hospitals. I've never given this any thought. And it was fascinating to see what the data showed. And it was that there have been a lot of closures in the last couple of decades. Yeah, or not even decades. 181 rural hospitals have closed since 2005. So you see that and you're just like, whoa, had no idea that was happening. This data it exists. And we were able to take that and call out something relevant to healthcare, right? So this says Sidecar Health because that's one of our brand partners. Healthcare is obviously, because of COVID, been top of mind for the last 2 years. But what other story can we tell? It's healthcare access in areas that don't have the same, like high quality hospitals or as many of them, right? So we took this, and then we thought, this is the point I haven't touched on yet, localizing is huge. I presented at MozCon last month. My entire presentation was on localization because that's how well it's doing for us. So we took this data, and that's the other beautiful thing about data is 9 times out of 10, if it's a great data set, it is broken down by state, zip, city, some kind of geographical or demographical breakdown. So we took that same data and then we said, let's focus on the individual states rather than the national story. So we created the national story, sent that out through the wire, or if you're pitching, in that case, you would pitch national publications. And then we took the same content and just reworked it a little, changed the headline, and focused specifically on Maryland being the #1 state with the fewest closures. This is an example, but we also did the states with the most closures and any states in between to say, here's what you should, like your state, how your state fares against the others. Because people in all of these local publications care about their state, not necessarily what's going on nationally, right? So here is a great example of taking one data set and getting a ton of value out of it. Rather than creating 15 new pieces of content, you're using the same data set to tell different stories, to your point. Here's the national story. Let's take a look at this. But now let's also examine it from a state by state perspective. So if that's the other great advantage about data and why I push it so much is because you're able to do things like this that can triple your, actually, I think it was literally, we did find that it doubled in a lot of cases, the links that we earned localized.
Wow. Okay. So we have a ton to unpack here with this specific example of this campaign. So I want to, Amanda, can we kind of walk through this whole process for folks? So like, let's start at the very beginning. So, this is sort of, in service of this company, Sidecar Health, right? So that's like sort of the client in question here. So talk to us a little bit about sort of, you're working with a client like Sidecar Health, and you're thinking about how do we earn links? What kind of stories can we tell? How do you sort of work through that process, or how do you come up with ideas?
Right. So to the point about creating tangential, this is the word that's thrown around, tangential content, meaning it's not topical. So we're not talking about Sidecar Health. And when they partnered with us, they knew that we weren't going to be doing that. Instead, it was, let's zoom out a bit and think about what's happening in health. For anybody listening, it's like kind of imagining where you would fall if you're on a news site in the top categories, like where you would go to look for a story about you. That's the realm you want to operate in. So it's just like the more zoomed out version of your industry.
Yeah,
So,
can we sit on that point for just a second and just kind of unpack that with a couple of examples? I think that's a great framework to kind of think about it is, where do we sit in sort of the categories here? So I don't know, maybe can we go through a couple of examples just to kind of help people understand what, kind of a tangential topic might be. So let's say it's Optimist, right? We do content marketing. What kind of, how might you approach that?
Yeah, so if you do content marketing, sure, you can talk about like your services. That's more topical. Right. Your case studies, why people need content marketing, like things that are helping move them through the funnel to convert. Yep. If I were to come to you and you're like, I just, we want to earn links and more broader authority in business, in company growth, right? Because ultimately, if we're talking about, like, zooming out is marketing. Zooming out further than that is just like growth and revenue. Like you're kind of going different levels. It could be content marketing in the context of like what do CMOs spend like investing in? What do like how many companies that are making a ton of money, what are they investing in? Like that top, like higher level of analysis, right? Yep. That's kind of like, it's a large spectrum of the type of content you can create. And as you toggle back and forth, there's value to all of it. It's what your objectives are. In the case of tangential content, it's more brand awareness, broader authority. So you're just getting broader brand authority because you're showing that you're caring about creating really like objective, interesting material that like news wants to cover. And then you're earning the top level links to your domain. So hopefully, as you said, rising tide raises all ships, uplift all the other content that you're creating that is about why you should have content marketing, why we're the best content marketing program, all the types of content marketing, the things that are more applicable to your brand. Yeah,
I love that. And one like kind of tiny point I just want to draw out that you mentioned there is that like, each example is a little bit unique, and also like the types of media that might tell this story are different, right? So like if we did a study, like you said, about CMOs and how they're spending money on content marketing or whatever, that's probably not going to, show up in, whatever, NBC or like, consumer news sites, but there's a whole slew of business media that would be interested in telling that story potentially. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind is that like, there's sort of this target audience, if you will, for each piece and what stories you're telling and who might actually cover that story.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Awesome. Okay, so sorry, we got a little bit sidetracked there, but so going back to the process here. So okay, so you're working with Sidecar Health. You guys say, okay, hey, look, we're not going to tell a story about Sidecar Health specifically, but they're thinking about healthcare and these specific topics related to healthcare. So we want to tell a story that kind of fits in with the overall brand narrative and is kind of tangentially relevant to the business. And so the topics that we do want to say rank for from an SEO perspective. Now tell me a little bit about the process of, sort of uncovering the story or finding this data, or, where do you start?
Yeah, that's a great question. And everybody does it differently. There's no right way. So I'll just throw some ideas out there, and you probably all, without even knowing it, have like an informal process that you go through. in your industry, you probably follow different industry publications. You probably already follow different, news sites just in your daily life. And I think the next thing to layer on are like trend sites. So Google Trends is the classic example. Exploding Topics is another. That's Brian Dean from Backlinks' newer company, where you can just track what is happening in your broader space that could be interesting. And you can tag on to that, like with the contextualizing component. So that's, one way to go about it is just being like, what are people talking about? And then how can I add something? Conversely, you can also just be looking through data sets and asking yourself what stories lie in those data sets. So finding out, really exploring the data that's available, even from the census. Like we think of the census as like, we record the census every several years and then we find out how many people live in the country. That's not, census has a ton of reports that come out at all different iterations, so tracking that stuff. I think you spend a couple hours just digging around and then adding to your calendar when it looks like the next report will go live. Those sorts of things. Additionally, like any events, anything that's recurring, we call them news pegs. I had never heard this term until I joined Stacker, because on the news side, it's news peg, which is something that is going to be talked about. And sometimes people stay away from that because they're like, well, it's going to be talked about. But if you have the foresight to be like, it is going to be talked about, but I'm going to come at it with like maybe more of a feature angle that talks about like the things we mentioned earlier, contextualizing, you can kill if you time it right. So having these things in your calendar, like I know exactly when that's going to happen. I know that this data set's out there, when that's going to be published. I think that's the first thing to do, is to get a sense of what exists and when it's going to be released. That's a good place to start.
I love that because I think, as you pointed out, in pretty much every industry or every vertical or however you want to slice and dice it, there are publications or organizations or universities or whatever that are consistently creating research or reports or whatever. Say it's every year they put out this report or every 3 years or whatever. And so just getting a handle on those, as you said, is such a great first step to sort of getting a sense of what data might be out there that would be relevant. That's the other thing to keep in mind, is like there's a bajillion data sets out there, but only a small fraction of those are going to be really probably relevant in your specific industry, or again, tangentially related to the topics that you care about as a company.
Right. And you can learn a lot from like even what other industries are doing and applying that to your own. Like maybe nobody's taken that approach. And BuzzSumo, if you already have a BuzzSumo account, you can be searching for the top engaged with content in pretty much any topic ever and get ideas from that. Like what methodologies are they using? What headline did they use that got people's attention? So you can also have this kind of like more creative route to it, which is just like dissecting what does well. And that's what our newsroom has, a Slack channel that's literally content inspiration. And they're just putting all kinds of stuff that they're seeing during their research and sharing it with everybody, being like, what is it? Like, this is so interesting. We should apply it in XYZ way. So build in part of your process or part of your like internal comms to allow for that level of, let's just take in what's happening online and actually take a beat to be like, why is this engaging? And what can we learn from this? And how can we apply it to anything that we do?
I love that. Yeah. So going back and maybe kind of recapping what you're sharing there, I would sort of characterize this as there's really like both a kind of a top down and a bottom up approach to coming up with these ideas. So top down meaning, hey, I'm going to look at what people are talking about related to healthcare. I'm going to figure out if there's sort of a unique angle or another story that we might be able to tell. And then I'm going to work backwards to see, is there data to kind of tell that story, right?
Yep.
And then the bottom up approach would be the opposite, where you're saying, hey, I've got this Google alert or whatever, and I see there's new data coming out, and I'm looking at that data, and I'm trying to figure out what stories might exist based on the data that I have available.
Yep, exactly. And I think for the top down version, another thing I tell people is that if you have a question about your industry and you don't know the answer and a quick Google search doesn't reveal it, run with that. Just run with it. You might not know immediately how you're going to get the answer, but that's a great start. It's like, ooh, a curiosity is always a great place to start from. And that's another thing, to just start jotting down notes as you read things, as you're just immersing yourself in the industry and Slack groups that you're in. If something comes up and you have a question, answering that question with data is often a really good option.
Very, very, very interesting. All right, so just to go back to this specific example, the rural hospitals campaign. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like this is sort of the original data source, the University of North Carolina.
Yeah, it looks like it.
Okay, so basically, you guys found, through one of those two approaches, you all found this data set that had been created and shared. And again, I think this is another important reminder, is that this isn't. I think a lot of people think of data and they think, oh my God, where am I going to get data, right? Like, that's crazy. That's going to cost me millions of dollars. Reality is there's tons and tons and tons of public data out there, right? Which is what you guys used here.
Yep.
So yeah, talk to me about, I guess, maybe the way that you found this data, and then sort of what happened from there, how you kind of figured out what to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, full disclosure, I didn't personally work on this, so I don't want to act like I know what everybody was thinking when they did it. But I think that your point about there's a ton of free public data, and making that list of that data and making sure that you have the permissions to share it, right? And then if I saw this, I would think to myself, I've never even thought about the fact that rural hospitals are closing, let alone that so many have closed. Like, if it catches you, like if you're reading this data set and you see the headline, you're like, wow, like, notice the initial reaction. Surprise and unexpected information always performs well when you're trying to do things, get news coverage. And then you can see very quickly that there's more to this data that is in the headline, which is why we took the local approach, because maybe I'm from Florida, okay, and we can say a whole lot about the fact that I'm from Florida and make fun of Florida. But I'm from Florida. I live in DC right now. I would probably still click on this story, but I would probably have like a much higher chance of clicking on it if they're talking about the closures in Florida, because people care about what's happening near them. So the example here is, if you see this and you ask yourself, okay, that's a good story already, but what else might be in this data set that isn't being covered in this headline and subhead, right? What can I add to it? And in our case, it was literally just, how do you focus it on a local level and send it to busy reporters who may not have seen this, report that went out, and yet would be fascinated to run it if you packaged it for them, right? So that's what when you have that data set, and it is a tough skill. It's not it's not often the same person who can clean up a data set, analyze it appropriately, and find the story in it, and then create the ultimate package, the images, the graphics, the writing. Like, that's why it's usually a team effort, because it's very few people in the world are great at all of those aspects of putting content together. But that's why you shouldn't be intimidated by data that exists, because a lot of the time it's taken to a certain point, and then you can step in and be like, cool, this data has at least been top level analyzed, or there's top level callouts, or even if not, give it to a data analyst, say, here's a data set, I have these questions about it. It's asking yourself, when you're looking at data, what do you wonder when you see it? Oh, that's interesting. I wonder how that differs between different generations. I wonder how that differs from state to state, right? And finding that, taking those insights out and pitching on that can be your ticket to earning a ton of media.
Right. Yeah. I think, going back to what we said before, right? Essentially, the whole approach here was, we found this data point that sort of exists in isolation, and then you add some context to that, or sort of do something with that data point to tell a story about it. What does that actually mean? So, again, just looking at this example, as you said, okay, 180 rural hospital closures since January 2005. Is that good? Is that bad? Is that more than before? Less than before?
Yeah.
And, which states are being impacted?
There's and they sort of touch on that with this other, like, 140 since 2010, and you're like, oh, okay, like, they're trying to get to that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Those are the exact kind of questions you should ask yourself when you see something like this. Like, what does that actually mean? And sometimes in headers, we'll do that. Like, we'll take a headline and say, instead of the raw number. Like there was one story that was like a certain number of people, got sick in some profession, and instead of saying the whole number, it was like 1 in 3. And that means something totally different to you, right?
Yep.
You're like, I know what 1 in 3 means, and that's a
Yep.
lot. I don't know what a raw number means because I don't know how many people are in that profession. You know what I mean? So you're absolutely right. You see, whatever it is, if it's a data set, a headline, these questions are what are going to spark the content that you can create that will be newsworthy.
That's awesome. Okay. Yeah. So I think that kind of hopefully gives everyone a little bit of an idea about kind of how the creative process works and like how you kind of come up with these stories and kind of put together the content. I don't want to go super deep into the actual production of the content, but do you have anything specific that you want to point out about like like sort of the final content itself, like what goes into then taking that data and turning it into something interesting?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, and that's like, I'm not a data analyst. I think having one on your team or contracting with one is awesome because it takes a little bit of the pressure off people who are like, if you have a writing background or something and you're intimidated by it. But once you have the insights, these call outs, you kind of go into it with a thesis and then you find out if you're proven wrong or not. So, and you can't bend, you're not trying to spin what you're seeing, but if you have a thesis, that means there's something potentially interesting here. If your thesis is confirmed, you kind of already know what you're going to run with as your headline and the main point. You might find something you didn't expect that's even more interesting, in which case you should go that way. Don't be like, and this is tough too when you work with clients of your agency side, like some people are afraid to go back and be like, well, I know we said we're going to do this, but actually we want to do this.
Right.
I would still recommend doing it. And I would recommend everybody try to be as flexible as possible with just running with where the story is rather than trying to force it to be something, because you're just going to end up with a better piece of content. But once you have those key insights, is making sure that those are elevated constantly. So, create the map or the graph or the chart or whatever it is that's illustrating the data, but make it very obvious what people are trying to glean from that. Most people are not going to spend more than 5 seconds trying to figure out what they're looking at. So if it's too convoluted for, give it to a friend and be like, do you know what this is trying to tell you? And they're like, I have no idea what this, scatter plot means to me. Then simplify it a little bit, because anybody, like even if the journalist gets it immediately, they know that their readers might not get it immediately. And any amount of friction, this kind of crosses over into pitching, any amount of friction that you're creating between somebody seeing what you created and deciding whether to run it is decreasing your chances of succeeding. So clear, concise, straight to the point. Just get the insights out there, have it in the headline. Make the subheaders really telling, like what they're about to read. Or if you don't want to put the insights in those things, have the curiosity gap element, meaning like you kind of implied like an interesting question that they'll get the answer to when they read the rest of it or look at the graph. But don't let them sit there for 10 to 20 seconds being like, why am I looking at this? Like, what is the point of this? Those are the things when you go to actually package it up into a written piece or images or whatever that you need to, that's crucial. That aspect.
That's sort of like the value really that you're providing to journalists or whomever, is that you are sort of doing that heavy lifting, right? Like as we talked about, like anybody could go look at this data set, but it takes work to analyze that and pull out the story. And so leading with that and sort of just telling them, okay, hey, it's not just here's a data set that we put together, it's we analyzed this and here's the story, here's what we found.
Yeah, they want to have something interesting that's done and ready to be run. They don't need a researcher. They would just, they have their own at their, like, they don't need you to just send them a data set. Cool. Like, what am I supposed to do with this? And, a lot of what we learned at Stacker, since we're we're a free newswire. So any of you could run any of our stories at any time for free. And why we do that is journalists want to focus on the stuff that's the most important to their communities. And they want to invest in that. And if you're giving them great content that they know will be interesting, they're going to be happy about that. It's just putting in the work of creating something good and pitching it to the right people. That's why it's tricky, but that's why it works if you do it well.
Right. Yeah. That's awesome. So thank you so much for walking us through all of that. A couple things I'd love to just touch on as a couple final notes, and then we'll try to get to some audience questions. So first of all, if you haven't already, drop your questions in the chat here, and like I said, we'll try to get to as many as we can. You touched briefly on outreach. I mentioned I was going to press you on that a little bit. So I know Stacker has kind of its own unique process there with the Newswire. But can you just tell us any tips or strategies for how somebody might do their own outreach if they were kind of doing this on their own?
Yeah, so I think this could be a whole other presentation, so I'm trying to distill it in my mind down to a few things. First of all, if you've done the content right and you have the insights and you know like what's interesting, right? You know what you're going to pitch because these are the interesting points. Like, don't pitch just we did a study on, it's like, no, you want to pitch like the insight, the interesting thing that's going to grab people's attention. But you got to pitch I keep saying pitch the right people. You can't just go to publication level. You have to understand what the writer covers. So you're doing research about writers. Writers have their own objectives. They have their own beats. And I think it's very common. I mean, I don't know about you, but this is even outside of our conversation, but I get pitched on stuff all the time, not content, just like try my tool or whatever. That has nothing to do with me. That has nothing to do with me. So they didn't research me at all. And journalists have been, unfortunately, bombarded with pitch emails over the last several years. It's become more and more of a common tactic, but people have been using templated pitches and sending out crap. So you really have to work hard to earn their attention. So the subject line in and of itself is a task. You got to get the subject line right. Maybe test it on a few, see if you're getting the opens, get like, there's various tools that track whether people are opening your email, see if people are opening your email. If they opened it, the subject line was catchy enough, keep going. If they're not opening it, test a different subject line. Once it's open, you have a limited amount of space to continue to capture the same with writing. If you have a writing background, you get it because it's the same thing. It's the headline they click on, the first sentence, you got to keep them going to the next sentence. So in your pitch email, it's, okay, this is the super interesting thing we found. This is why I'm reaching out to you basically because I think it's relevant to the stuff that you cover. And don't like literally say that, but like, oh, this piece you did recently on this topic made me think this is a great fit for your audience. Personalizing is ideal if you're able to, call out a story that you saw that they did or reference something on Twitter that they posted. Some reporters and writers literally have on their Twitter how they prefer to be pitched and like the stories that they're looking for. You got to take those extra couple steps because if say they do something like that and you ignore it, they're never going to give you the time of day. So that's what I mean by it's so difficult is like the work you have to do up front to even put the pitch together so that you have a higher chance of success. But that's why it's so great to use the same data set and change, like the angles on it, like localizing, because then at least you're not creating entirely new projects every time you're sending out more pitches. It's like, okay, the content's done. Now we're going to focus on promotion and, okay, we're going to do like the national publications or the business publications or the health publications. And now we're going to broaden out to all the local publishers, like where the most hospitals close, where the least hospitals close and everywhere in between. And kind of see how it's going. But and the other kind of like umbrella tip would be like reducing friction again. So not leaving them guessing in the body of your email why your piece is interesting, like saying exactly, calling out like what is compelling. Don't maybe this is debatable, but like saying, oh, let me know if you're interested, and then I'll follow up with like everything else. Like any step or click or anything that you introduce, your chances are lower. So make it easy, show them very quickly that it's interesting to them and they can run it immediately or whatever if it's whatever the conditions are, and just keep it simple.
Yeah, it's funny. It's very similar to I think a lot of the tips that you would hear on any kind of like cold email outreach or any link building emails or whatever, right? But yeah, I mean, make it about the story, not about yourself. That kind of stuff is always so important.
Totally.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I know that there's a ton we could go into on detail there. If you do have any specific questions about sort of the outreach angle, again, pop them in the chat here. We'll try to get to them. I guess I have two maybe final questions for you. And I'll package them together. so we talked about the idea of newsworthiness, which I think is so
Mm-hmm.
central, so key here, right? So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say that is sort of the number one thing that they have to get right when you're executing this is you have to make something that's newsworthy. Otherwise, of course, it's not going to get picked up.
Yep.
So the first part of the question is define newsworthiness for us and sort of what the elements are of that. And then the second part of the question is, what do people get wrong?
It's funny you ask that because I have a newsletter through Stacker Studio, which if you go to our page, you can sign up. There's like a banner at the top. And last issue, I was trying to hunt down in journalism school when I was at the University of Florida what the elements of newsworthiness were that we were taught, because I can't find it. And I finally found it. I think it was on like the Purdue site, like their writing lab site. And I was like, this is it. Like they took an excerpt from the book that it's from. And I don't understand why we don't talk about this more as marketers and content. I was like, this needs to be everywhere, and I couldn't find it. So, and I don't have it in front of me, but like the major ones that we've already alluded to. Timeliness, that's the breaking news element. Did this thing just happen? If it just happened, we care. Proximity, that's the local element. People inherently care more about what's happening near them than things that are happening farther away. Other things that you can consider, significance is one, which can be also called impact, which basically means how many people is this relevant to. So that's tangential works well because it tends to be relevant to more people. People who are trying to hire like an internal communication SaaS product or onboard a SaaS product are not going to be the same like volume of audience as people who work from home, for example, and you do a piece about working from home, right? So significance and impact, how many people does this affect? That increases the newsworthiness. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones off the top of my head. Then some of them are kind of fun, and it's funny because they're like, that they're there because it's hard to articulate otherwise, but like novelty or oddities, like things that are just so different from the norm that you're just fascinated. Like you see that all the time in the news. It's like, this doesn't really affect me, but it's so interesting because it's so weird. That also applies, and it's really cool to see newsrooms label these things as this is what people are interested in. Like this is we know, we run the stories, we see what does well. I should just like see if I can search for it really quick. Because I refer to it a lot. I think I found it. So I'm going to drop it in here. So the one that I'm talking about is the shoemaker list. So can I drop it in the comments? I don't know. Oh, you're on mute.
Not sure actually if you can, but if you put it in the private chat here, I'll
that's the wrong link. I'm not sure. For some reason, it does not want to copy. Technical issues, people. 1 second. There we go. It's the second list is just like, put that on a Post-it note, and keep that around, because so many of these, timeliness, proximity, impact, conflict. That's a storytelling mechanism across the board. Conflict. Prominence, that's another good one. Like why celebrity content always does really well. It's because if people are well known, politicians, celebrities, whatever it is, that's inherently more newsworthy than if it happens to your neighbor who nobody knows. So this is just like a great list of things when you have a general topic maybe, and ask yourself, well, what about this aspect of it? Is it newsworthy? Or if it's not, how can we make it newsworthy? Let's think about like some of these other directions.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that's such a critical thing. And I'm looking ahead here to the questions that people are asking. So John was asking about what are sort of the deciding factors for getting these, and I think, would you agree that that's sort of the main one, is just sort of these different elements of newsworthiness?
Yeah, I think for the content itself, it's the newsworthy element, and then I think for the pitching, it's the targeting, meaning you're pitching the right people. Those are the two biggest factors.
Do you pitch both writers and editors, or would you suggest that?
That's a good question. I actually just saw something on this recently. I wish I could find it. It was basically like some editors saying like, we don't publish anymore. Like the writers who do. So it
Interesting.
depends. Like for us, because they're republishing a full story, it could be an editor. But if you're pitching a data point or like a study and you want somebody to cover it, it's probably a writer who's
Right.
literally putting the stories together. Like you could,
Mhm.
I'm not going to say universally. I think that in general, that's probably the way to go. But that's
Mhm.
where some of that research comes in. Like certain publications might be structured differently, and maybe the editor like decides everything. But a lot of the time, the writer goes up to the editor and they pitch. You can pitch somebody and they'll say, "I like this. I want to run it by my editor in a meeting this week, and I'll get back to you."
Awesome. Yeah, that's super helpful. So we're kind of at time here. Do you have a couple extra minutes just to go through a couple final
Sure.
bullet points?
Yeah.
Okay. So I just wanted to circle back to that question. Any specific mistakes or, looking back at sort of past campaigns that y'all have done, things that you would do differently or change that you think, were not successful?
There's so many different things you can tap into here. I think some of it's just expectations. Um, I think people don't realize like how much time it's going to take, and that if you pitch like 5 people and you don't get a response, it was a failure. Like, uh, you're gonna get you're not gonna get a response from everybody you pitch. In fact, it's going to be a pretty low percentage. Um, if you're doing your job right, you will get responses. And sometimes they're going to say like, "Hey, this is really cool, but like for whatever reason we can't run it," right? But like really, like don't overlook those signals. Everything that you get, whether it's an open notification or a response from a reporter, all say something to you, and they can help you revamp and help you pivot the strategy going forward. So that's one thing. Like if you're just kind of like, you put your effort out and it doesn't work, and then you kind of just give up. Biggest mistake for the content. I think honestly, I think it's back to what I mentioned before, where it's like you don't run where the story is. You're like upset when you're trying to do something and it's not panning out the way that you thought. And it's just, you're like wrangling with it forever, and it becomes, you end up hating it. You end up just hating the content after a while. Um, you know, it's being able to pivot in both aspects. If you don't do that, you're not going to get what you want out of this whole process.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think, what you're describing is like, hey, we set out, we're trying to show that more people are investing in content marketing or whatever. And that, like you said, that's sort of the hypothesis. And then the
Mm-hmm.
data comes back and it tells us something different. Then we're trying to sort of force that story or do something with it. Is that, first of all, is that kind of what you're describing in terms of like
Yeah, it's
following
like,
the
oh,
story?
our thesis is incorrect and maybe it's not interesting anymore. Actually, like our editor in chief was just talking to us about this on an offsite or an all staff, where they're like, you got to just, it can suck, but you got to just kill it sometimes. You could have worked
Yeah.
on it for days, and sometimes you just have to kill it altogether.
Yeah.
And it's that discernment, which is
Mm-hmm.
very reflective of like being in a newsroom. But if you're like trying to create something newsworthy, you have to really be honest with yourself. Is this interesting? If it's not, I've worked on a project like that myself, where I like pulled the data. I'm like, I feel like this could be so cool, and I spent the time to like manually pull it all, and I was so sad when it didn't show me what I thought it was going to show me. And I sat
Yep.
there and I was like, how do I make this work? How do I make this work? That's like the human instinct. But ultimately, I
Yep.
didn't do anything with it because there was no story. And to instead try to make a story out of it, you're not going to get coverage for it. Like you can barely make it something interesting to yourself. So that discernment, I think, is important.
Yep. And I think the other thing too you mentioned is like sometimes the strategy there is just to pivot too. Maybe the story that you thought you were going to tell is not there, but the data did tell us something else that's maybe interesting. And
Totally.
again, being able to adjust the strategy. So don't go into it quite with a super specific expectation. And then
Yeah.
again, to the point of expectations that you mentioned before, is that like sometimes you got to start over, and it takes time and takes money, right? Like,
Yeah, unfortunately, but that's the reality of this work.
awesome, cool. Well, I think we covered most of the questions here. Again, folks, if you do have questions, Amanda is in our Slack, so I'm guessing she would be happy to answer some questions for you if you want to pop into the top of the funnel. We would love to have you there. Amanda, thank you so much for the conversation today. It was really great to look at the specific example and kind of talk through the whole process. Anything else you want to share with anybody? Any final notes?
No, I mean, I definitely come into the Slack and ask me questions. If you can't tell, I can talk for ages. So I'm happy, like, people will pop into Slack sometimes and ask me specific, like, oh, this is what I'm working on. What do you think? I'm happy to answer questions like that. So yeah, please do reach out, because I know some of this is hard when you don't have the specific examples or the templates or frameworks. So please do reach out. I'm happy to chat.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks all for joining us today. Again, if you're not already a member of Top of the Funnel, yesoptimist.com/tofu, you'll find me there. Amanda, we got all kinds of awesome upcoming sessions. And one final mention of her company, Stacker Studio. You can check it out, studio.stacker.com. And it sounds like you can sign up for her newsletter and learn more from her. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Amanda. Thanks all for joining. Hope everyone has a great day, and talk to you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.